The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that split the afternoon silence. $7. And just like that, Wren Calloway owned 80 acres of land that nobody else wanted. She was 18 years old. She had $12 left in her pocket. And she was standing in the middle of a Montana courthouse room, holding a set of keys so rusted they looked like they might crumble in her hand, while six men old enough to be her grandfather exchanged glances that said everything their mouths didn't bother to say. They didn't laugh. That would have required too much energy. Instead, they just looked at her the way people look at someone who has made a mistake so obvious, so complete, that mockery would almost be a kindness. Wren looked back at them and said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence was cheaper than words and usually worth more. But to understand why a girl with $12 and no home and no family and no reason to believe the world owed her anything would spend 7 of those dollars on 80 acres of broken Montana land, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand what it means to grow up belonging to no one. You have to understand what a name means when it's the only thing you have. My name is Wren Calloway, and for the first 18 years of my life, I didn't know that name meant anything at all. The morning I left St. Benedict's Children's Home in Lincoln, Nebraska, the sky was the color of old dishwater. March in Nebraska is not a beautiful month. It is the month when winter has overstayed its welcome, and spring hasn't bothered to show up yet, and everything in between is just gray and cold and waiting. Mrs. Paulson found me after breakfast. She was the kind of woman who had been doing a hard job for so long that the hardness had worked its way into her face, into the set of her shoulders, into the specific way she smiled when she had something difficult to say. She had been running St. Benedict's for 19 years. She was not unkind. She was just worn thin by too many children and not enough miracles. "Wren," she said. Her voice had that softness that meant bad news. "Come to my office." I followed her down the hallway I had walked 1,000 times, past the bulletin board with its faded notices, past the television room where the set was always on and nobody was ever really watching, past the window that looked out on the parking lot where social workers came and went, taking some children and leaving others. I had always been one of the others. In her office, Mrs. Paulson handed me an envelope and a small cardboard box. The envelope held $175 in state allowance money. The box held everything that remained of my mother. "Your mother's effects," Mrs. Paulson said. "We held them in storage until you were old enough. There's nothing else in your file, Wren. No father listed, no known relatives. I'm sorry." I took the box. It was light enough to hold in one hand. 14 years in the system, and this was all that was left. "Good luck," she said. That was it. That was goodbye. I opened the box that night in the Greyhound station in Lincoln, waiting for a bus to anywhere that wasn't here. I had bought the cheapest ticket heading west because west felt like possibility, and possibility was the only thing I had left to spend. Inside the box, I found 3 things. A silver ring, tarnished almost black, with the initials EC etched on the inside band in careful, old-fashioned script. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be my birth certificate. Mother, Jessica Calloway. Father, unknown. Place of birth, Harlow, Montana. And a photograph. It was a Polaroid, soft around the edges the way old photographs get, the colors fading toward yellow. A young woman stood in front of a white farmhouse, one hand raised to shade her eyes from the sun. She was young, maybe 17, and she was smiling in a way that looked almost defiant, like she was daring the camera to capture something she wasn't ready to give away. Her jaw had a set to it that I recognized. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the faded image. Behind her, the farmhouse rose white against a blue sky. A porch wrapped around the front. A barn sat in the distance, red gone to rust pink with age. And all around, fields stretched to a horizon that seemed to go on forever. On the back, someone had written in careful cursive, "Mama's Place, Harlow, Montana, 1999. I turned the photograph over and looked at the woman again. At my mother. I had her jaw. That stubborn jut that Mrs. Paulson used to call your difficult face. I had her eyes, too, that same dark quality, almost black in certain light. But I didn't have her smile. I didn't have her ease in front of the camera. I didn't have whatever it was that let a person stand in the Montana sun and look at the world like it might actually give them something worth having. I had nothing. Except now I had a place. a name, Harlow, Montana, and that was enough to keep moving. The next 2 years are not easy to talk about, not because they were especially cruel. I have heard worse stories from other children who aged out of the system, stories that made mine look almost comfortable by comparison. But those years taught me things about the world that I would have preferred to learn more slowly, in smaller doses, with someone beside me to help make sense of them. I worked. That was the simple version. I washed dishes in a truck stop diner outside Cheyenne until the owner's son started lingering near the storage room, and I had to leave fast. I picked apples in an orchard near Bozeman until the season ended, and the foreman handed me my last check with the look of a man who feels bad about something, but not bad enough to do anything differently. I cleaned rooms in a motel in a town so small it didn't appear on the maps I'd looked at. I slept in bus stations when I had enough money for a ticket somewhere. I slept in shelters when they had room. I slept behind a laundromat one November, curled against the warm exhaust vent, and woke up with frost in my hair and a clarity about my life that was almost peaceful in its simplicity. I had to find something that was mine, or I had to accept that nothing ever would be. Every library I passed, I stopped. Every computer with free internet access, I searched. Harlow, Montana, Callaway family, any combination of words I could think of. For 18 months, I found nothing useful. Property records that dead-ended. A town name that appeared in old county directories and almost nowhere else. And then, in the public library in Billings, Montana, in the second week of March 2018, I found everything. The records were in the county clerk's digital archive, scanned from paper files, buried in a database that looked like nobody had accessed it in years. Property records, tax documents, the bones of a place called Harlow. I learned that Harlow had once been a real town, maybe 400 people at its peak, back in the 40s. A feed store, a church, a school, farms spreading out in every direction along the river valley until the river ran low every August, and the good years stopped coming as regularly as they once had. Now the population hovered around 800. The school had closed in 2001, and the church held services twice a month when the traveling preacher made his circuit. But the property records still existed, and in those records I found her, Evelyn Callaway, 80 acres, Section 12, Township 4 North, primary residence, one farmhouse, one barn, various outbuildings. Property acquired 1952. Owner deceased, January 14, 2018. Evelyn Callaway had been my great-grandmother. She had owned the farm in that photograph. She had lived there for 60 years, and she had died 2 months ago. I sat at that library computer for a long time, staring at the screen. At the bottom of the record, a notice. Property taxes unpaid. Estimated outstanding debt, $6,200. Property scheduled for county auction. Minimum bid, $5. Date, March 15th. I looked at the date in the corner of the screen. March 12th. 3 days. I had $140 left. I had a backpack with 2 changes of clothes, a rain jacket, a library card from a county in Wyoming, and a Polaroid photograph of a woman who had died before I could reach her. I closed the browser and went to buy a bus ticket to Harlow. The man at the Greyhound counter looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language when I named the town. He had to look it up. Then he printed the ticket without comment, the way people in service jobs learn to do when they've seen enough of the world to know that questions only slow things down. I sat in the back of the bus and held the photograph in my hands for most of the 6-hour ride. I looked at my mother's face, at the White House behind her, at the fields that stretched out in every direction like a promise someone had made before I was born. Harlow appeared around a bend in the highway, like a place that was slowly deciding whether it wanted to exist. The main street ran 4 blocks long, a feed store at one end, its painted sign bleached nearly white by decades of Montana sun. A diner at the other end, smoke rising from a metal chimney pipe. Between them, a hardware store, a post office the size of a large closet, a church with a hand-lettered sign out front, and 2 empty storefronts with plywood where the windows used to be. The county clerk's office shared a building with the post office. A woman named Doris sat behind a counter that had probably been installed during the Eisenhower administration. She looked up when I came in, took in my backpack and my boots and my age, and waited. "I'm here about the Callaway property auction," I said. "Tomorrow at 10. She nodded. "You planning to bid?" Maybe. She looked at me the way people in small towns look at strangers. Not unfriendly, just thorough. Roof's half gone on the main house, she said. Pipes froze and burst, probably 3 winters running. Nobody's been out there since Evelyn passed. I know. Takes more than the minimum bid to make it livable. Probably more than most people have. I know that too. Doris shrugged. She had the manner of a woman who had seen plenty of things she couldn't explain and had long since made her peace with that. Auctions at 10, she repeated. Courthouse, second floor. I thanked her and went to find somewhere to sleep. The diner was called Loretta's, which turned out to be both the name of the establishment and the name of the woman who ran it. Loretta Wynn was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, with red hair going gray at the temples, and an efficiency of movement that comes from decades of carrying plates and refilling coffee cups and watching people come and go from a small town that mostly saw people go. She fed me a bowl of soup and a piece of cornbread for $3 and didn't ask questions. When I mentioned I needed somewhere to stay the night, she pointed me toward a room above the hardware store that she rented out occasionally for $12. Clean sheets, she said. Heat works most of the time. I paid her and climbed the narrow stairs and sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like sawdust and old paint. And I held my mother's photograph and thought about what I was doing. I had $128. Minimum bid was $5. Back taxes were $6,200. But the auction paperwork said the county would work out a payment plan, 90 days to settle at least a partial amount. I had no job, no skills beyond what 2 years of survival had taught me. No one in this town or any other town who knew my name. But my great-grandmother had lived in that house for 60 years. My mother had stood in front of it and smiled in a way I had never once managed in my own life. And somewhere in that farmhouse was the only answer to the only question I had ever really cared about. Who am I, and where do I come from? I put the photograph in my jacket pocket and went to sleep. The auction room smelled like dust and old wood and the staleness of a space used only occasionally. 6 men sat in folding chairs arranged in 2 rows. They ranged from 60 to perhaps 80 years old, and they had the look of men who attended county auctions the way other people attend church, out of habit and a vague sense that something important might happen, even when it usually didn't. The county clerk, a thin man named Henderson, who read from a clipboard with the flat delivery of someone reading a grocery list, moved through the first 3 properties quickly. An empty lot, sold for $50. A burned-out gas station at the edge of town, sold for $100. 30 acres of scrub land along the dry creek bed, sold for $200 to a man in the back row who didn't even look up from his phone. Then Henderson got to the last item. Callaway property, he read, 80 acres, section 12. Farmhouse, barn, various outbuildings. Condition as is. Existing debt $6,200. Minimum bid $5. He looked up. Nobody moved. The clock on the wall ticked. Someone in the hallway outside dropped something metal, and the sound rang through the old building and faded into nothing. $5, Henderson said again. Anyone? I raised my hand. $7. The room shifted. A few of the men turned to look at me. I saw it in their faces, not cruelty, just that expression people wear when they witness something they cannot quite categorize. Amusement, maybe. The involuntary pity reserved for people who don't know what they're getting into. $7, Henderson repeated. He sounded almost surprised. Do I hear 8? Silence. Going once. Silence. Going twice. The gavel came down. Sold. I walked to the front of the room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. I signed my name on the transfer document. My hand was shaking, but my signature was clear. Wren Callaway. Henderson handed me a receipt in a small envelope containing 2 keys, both of them orange-red with rust. Congratulations, he said, without any warmth at all. You've got 90 days to settle the outstanding tax debt, or the county reclaims the property. I nodded. 90 days. $6,200. I had $121 and no plan whatsoever. But I had something I had never had before in my life. I had a place that had my name on it. The walk to the farm took just under 2 hours along a road that shifted from asphalt to gravel to packed dirt as it moved away from town. The fields on either side had gone wild with years of neglect. Brown grass stood chest-high in places, moving in the wind like something restless and alive. The sky overhead was enormous, the kind of sky that doesn't exist in cities or institutions, where the horizon is always blocked by something built by human hands. Here there was nothing between me and the edge of the world. It should have felt like freedom. Mostly it felt like the specific kind of alone that comes before something either very good or very bad. The house appeared first, rising from the flat land around it like something that had grown there slowly over a very long time and put down roots too deep to move. White paint peeled from the clapboards in long curling strips. The porch sagged badly on the left side, one support post gone entirely. 3 windows on the upper floor were open holes where glass had been. The roof was the thing that took my breath away, not in a good way. A full section of it on the northwest corner had collapsed, leaving a jagged opening that exposed the attic to whatever Montana wanted to throw at it. Behind the house, a barn leaned at an angle that seemed to argue with gravity. Red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The doors hung open at irregular angles, and everywhere the grass had taken over. It swallowed what might have been a path from the road to the porch. It rose around the base of the house like slow water. It reached toward the lower windows as if testing whether they might let it in. I stood at the edge of the property for a long time. The wind came across the fields from the west and pushed against me, steady and indifferent. I thought about turning around. I had enough left for a bus ticket somewhere warmer. I could find another diner, another motel room, another laundromat vent to sleep against. I had done it before. I knew how. But I had tried that life for 2 years. I knew exactly where it led. It led to another version of the same nowhere I had been running from since I was 16 years old. I took a breath and walked toward the house. The front door wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully closed. The frame had warped so badly that the door sat crooked in its opening, leaving a gap along the top wide enough for weather and small animals to pass through freely. When I pushed it, it moved with a sound like a groan, something between wood and rust and time. The smell hit me first. Mold and rot and the sweet, sour weight of a place that had been closed up and forgotten. Underneath that, something older. Wood smoke, maybe. The ghost of 100 years of winters. I stepped inside. The living room had been beautiful once. I could see it underneath the damage the way you can sometimes see the person someone used to be underneath what the years have done to them. High ceilings. A stone fireplace that ran floor to almost ceiling on the far wall. The stones fitted together without mortar in the old way, each one chosen for how it sat against its neighbors. Windows that would have let light in on 3 sides. Wide plank floors that had probably been golden once and were now soft and buckled with water damage. Plaster hung from the ceiling in long, irregular sheets. A family of something had nested in the corner and left evidence of their stay spread across what remained of a braided rug. The fireplace was cold and had been cold for a long time, the grate rusted shut, the hearth dusty with what might have been the ash of the last fire Evelyn ever lit. I moved through the room slowly, testing each step before I committed my weight. Kitchen. The counters had crumbled at the edges. The sink hung loose from the wall, one side lower than the other. A window above it looked out on what had been a kitchen garden, now just a tangle of dead stems and weeds reaching up through the frost-hard ground. A bedroom. A mattress reduced to springs and dark stains. A dresser with 3 drawers and one missing, the wood swollen and warped. A bathroom. Better left undescribed. But the bones were there. Under all of it, I could feel the solid structure of the place, the thick walls and the heavy beams and the foundation that had held for close to a century. The core of it was sound. I knew it the way you know certain things, not because you've been taught them, but because something older than education recognizes them. "It'll hold," I said out loud. My voice sounded small in the empty house. Hopeful, maybe, or just very, very tired. I kept moving. In the back room, which might have been a sitting room or a sewing room or both at different times in the house's long life, I found the first signs that someone had truly lived here. Not just existed, lived. A bookshelf still standing, still holding books. I ran my finger along the spines. Farming guides and veterinary manuals, and several novels, and a Bible with a cracked spine, and a collection of pressed wildflowers tucked between Psalms and Proverbs. A rocking chair near the window, its cushion chewed down to the stuffing, but its frame solid and unbroken. A basket of yarn, the skeins faded but the colors still visible underneath, cornflower blue in the warm gold of a field in August. And on the wall, photographs. I approached them the way you approach something you're afraid might not survive being touched. They were old, many of them, black and white, edges soft. A man in overalls standing beside a tractor so old it looked like a museum piece. A woman in a floral dress holding an infant up toward the camera, both of them squinting against bright summer sun. Two children running toward whoever was holding the camera, their mouths open in laughter that had happened so long ago it had passed through time and become something almost abstract. In the center of the arrangement, in a frame made of hammered silver gone gray with age, was a photograph I recognized. A young woman, maybe 17, standing in front of this house, one hand raised to shade her eyes from the sun. Her jaw set at that angle I knew from the mirror, her smile daring the camera to catch what she wasn't ready to give. My mother. I stood very still for a long time. She had stood in this room. She had looked at these walls. She had been a person in this house with a name and a family and a place in the world. And then something had happened, and she had gone. And 14 years later, she had died in a car accident in a state far from here, leaving behind a 4-year-old girl in a cardboard box in a ring with someone else's initials in a photograph that had taken 18 years to come home. I reached out and touched the glass of the frame. It was cool under my fingers, solid, real. I sank down onto the floor and I cried until I had nothing left. That night I slept in the cab of an old pickup truck I found parked in what had once been a garage behind the house. It was a 1991 Chevrolet, rust-eaten along the wheel wells, but the cab was dry and the seats were only cracked leather, not mold. When I turned the key, the engine coughed twice and quit. But the cab held heat from the thin afternoon sun, and when I curled up with my jacket as a blanket and my backpack wedged under my head, I slept harder and deeper than I had in months. March in Montana does not forgive you for arriving unprepared. The cold that woke her before dawn was the cold of early spring in the high country, the kind that feels personal, that finds the gap between your collar and your jaw and stays there. When she got the truck door open and stepped out, the frost crunched under her boots and her breath came out in long clouds. And for a moment, the physical shock of it pushed everything else aside. Then she looked up. The sky was pink and orange and gold, spreading from the eastern horizon like something on fire just below the edge of the earth. The field stretched out in every direction, silver with frost, catching the first light and throwing it back. The barn and the broken house and the wild grass all went quiet under it. Everything went quiet. She had never seen a sky like that. Not once. In 18 years of bus stations and dormitory windows and parking lot fluorescents, had she seen anything like that sky? My land, she said, out loud, to the empty morning. The words felt strange in her mouth, foreign, like a language she was only beginning to learn. She said them again anyway. My land. She went back to the house as soon as there was enough light to work by. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before she started making promises to herself she couldn't keep. And she needed to search more carefully. Because the night before, in the last hour before she fell asleep in the truck, she had finally opened the box again and read the letter she had found tucked beneath her mother's birth certificate. A letter so old that the fold lines had nearly worn through the paper. It was addressed to Jessica, her mother, in handwriting that was careful and slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who had learned penmanship in a time when penmanship was considered a serious skill. My dearest Jessie, I don't know if you will ever come back. I pray every day that you will. But if you don't, I want you to know that I forgive you. Whatever made you run that night, it doesn't change what you are. You are my granddaughter. You are my blood. And if you ever do find your way home, look under the barn. Your grandfather built it during the war, when he thought the world might end. I've kept it up. Everything you'd need to start over is down there. Come home, Jessie. Please come home. All my love, your grandmother, Evelyn. The letter wasn't dated, but it had been in her mother's box when she died, which meant she had kept it, carried it, maybe read it more times than anyone would ever know. Maybe she had meant to come back. Maybe she had tried. Maybe she had spent every year of her short life planning to return to this place and never found the way. Wren would never know. But she could find the hiding place. She could find what Evelyn had left behind. The barn was worse than the house in the way a person can be worse than their surroundings, more damaged on the inside than the outside suggests. The main structure leaned so far east that standing inside it felt like standing on a boat in a slow roll. Half the roof had come down, creating a mountain of collapsed timber and old hay and rusted hardware that filled most of the interior and made the air thick with ancient dust. But the floor was there. Wide wooden planks, dark with age, warped in places, but solid enough when she tested them one at a time. She started in the corner furthest from the collapsed section, moving along the wall, running her hands along the edges of each plank, feeling for a seam, a hinge, any variation that suggested something underneath. 2 hours. Her knees ached. Her fingers were numb. The cold inside the barn was a different kind of cold from outside, stale and still and somehow heavier. She found it by accident. Her boot caught on something metal beneath a thick mat of old straw, and she went down hard on one knee. When she pushed the straw aside, she found an iron ring flush with the floor, the kind of ring that had been set there deliberately and carefully by someone who expected it to last. She pulled. The door was heavy enough that her first 3 attempts did nothing. On the fourth, something gave. The hinges, old and stiff, turned with a sound like a complaint, and slowly, inch by inch, a section of the floor came up. Below it, wooden stairs descended into darkness. Her phone battery was at 11%. She turned on the flashlight and went down. The room below was 8 feet by 8 feet, maybe less. The walls were lined with shelves built from the same rough lumber as the stairs, and the shelves held things that someone had put there with care, with thought, with the intention that whatever was down here should last. Canned goods, dozens of them, some dating back far enough that the labels had faded to near illegibility. Tools wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept the rust off for years. Sealed mason jars of seeds, their paper labels hand-lettered in careful print. A lantern and a box of matches in a waterproof case. A first aid kit, old but complete. And on a small wooden table against the far wall, a metal box. A strong box, the old kind, with a hasp but no padlock, as though whoever had placed it there had decided that the locked door above was security enough. She opened it. Inside was money. $1,100, mostly 20s and 10s, bound in bundles with rubber bands that crumbled to dust when she touched them. An old leather journal, its cover worn smooth with handling, its pages yellow at the edges. A folded legal document that turned out to be the original homestead claim on the property, dated 1923, signed by a man named Edmund Calloway in ink that had gone brown with age. And beneath all of that, tied together with a length of faded blue ribbon, a collection of envelopes. 47 of them, each one in a different condition, some crisp, some soft with handling. Each one addressed in the same handwriting, that same careful, slightly formal script. Each one stamped in red, return to sender, address unknown. They were letters. Letters Evelyn had written to her mother year after year, address after address, everyone returned. Under the letters, something else. Something held together by a second ribbon, this one pink and frayed at the ends. 13 envelopes, smaller than the letters, each one sealed, each one numbered on the outside in pencil, 1 through 13, and on each one, below the number, a name. Wren Calloway, wherever you are. She sat down on the bottom step of the wooden staircase, and she held them in her lap for a moment before she could bring herself to open the first one. It was a birthday card, handmade, the paper cut from something thicker, a wildflower pressed and dried and glued to the front. Inside, in that careful handwriting, smaller now, more compressed, as though she was trying to fit everything she had to say into a space that wasn't quite large enough. Happy 5th birthday, my dearest Wren. I don't know where you are. I don't know if your mother ever told you about me. I don't know if you'll ever read this. But somewhere in the world, you are turning 5 years old today, and I want you to know that someone is thinking of you, that someone loves you, even from a distance you can't see across yet. Your great-grandmother, Evelyn. She opened the second, the third, the fourth. Year after year, each card a small window into a life she had never known existed, a life that had been running parallel to hers the whole time without ever touching it. Evelyn wrote about the farm, about the weather, the way a good growing season felt different in the air from a dry one, how you could tell by February whether March would be kind. She wrote about the apple trees, which ones still bore fruit and which had given up. She wrote about the cat she adopted the year Wren turned 7 and named Hope, and how Hope had lived to be 14 and died on a warm afternoon in October and was buried under the old oak at the edge of the East Field. She wrote about the neighbors who came and went, about Ida Marsh at the Feed and Supply, who had been her friend for 50 years and still stopped by on Thursdays, about the way the light looked in August when the wheat was ripe and the whole valley turned the color of something precious. She wrote about waiting. That was the part that stayed with Wren, page after page of it. The patient wait of someone who keeps the light on long after the hour when hope would tell you to put it out. "I keep your room ready," she wrote in the card for the 11th birthday. "The quilt on the bed is one I made the winter you were born. Your mother told me your name in the one letter she ever sent." She never wrote again after that. "But I've kept your name like a seed, Wren. I've kept your room like a promise." The last card was numbered 13. Wren opened it slowly, the way you open something you're afraid won't be as good as what came before. The handwriting was different, shaky, the letters uneven in a way they hadn't been in the earlier cards, the pen having pressed too hard in some places and too lightly in others, as though the hand holding it had become unreliable. "My dearest Wren, you are 17 now, nearly grown. I don't have much time left, and I think part of me has known that for a while. I want you to know that I've left everything for you. The land, the money under the barn, everything in this house that's still worth anything. It's all yours if you want it, if you can find it. I don't know if you'll ever see these words, but I wrote them anyway, because you deserve to have someone write them. You deserve birthday cards, and someone who thought about you on your birthday, and a room with a quilt on the bed. You deserved all of it. I'm sorry I couldn't give it to you in person. Come home, Wren. Come home. All my love. Your great-grandmother, Evelyn." She had died 11 days after writing those words. She had held on until she couldn't hold on anymore, and then she had let go, and the house had sat empty, and the room had sat waiting, and the cards had sat in the metal box under the barn floor for 2 months, until the day Wren walked down those stairs and found them. She pressed the last card against her chest. She sat in the cold underground room that a man named Edmund Calloway had built during a war he was afraid might end everything, in the dark with her phone flashlight slowly dying, and she cried with a completeness that she had never allowed herself before. Not in bus stations, not behind laundromats, not in any of the places she had slept in the past 2 years, with the practiced stillness of someone who has learned not to make sounds that attract attention. Down here, nobody could hear her, so she let herself make the sounds. She cried for her mother, who had run from something she didn't yet understand, and died in a car accident in a state she had probably never meant to stop in. She cried for Evelyn, who had written to an address that never received the letters and made birthday cards for a child she had never met, and kept a room ready for 17 years on the strength of nothing but love and stubbornness. She cried for the version of herself that had grown up without this, without the weight of it, without the warmth of it, without any of it. And when she had finished, when the crying had run its course the way weather runs its course, she wiped her face on her jacket sleeve and sat very still in the quiet. Then she counted the money. $1,100. The back taxes were $6,200. But 90 days was 90 days, and she had a place to sleep, and a set of keys that were hers, and a name that meant something in this particular piece of Montana ground. She picked up the leather journal and the 13 birthday cards, and the 47 return letters, and put them carefully into her backpack, next to the Polaroid photograph of her mother standing in the sun. Then she climbed back up the stairs and pulled the hatch closed behind her and stood in the ruined barn in the gray morning light. Outside, the wind had come up from the west again. The grass moved in long waves across the fields. The farmhouse stood as it had stood for nearly 100 years, damaged and emptied and waiting, its white paint peeling in the cold air, its broken windows open to whatever the sky intended to send. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put the keys in her pocket and walked toward it. There was a great deal of work to do. The first thing Wren learned about Harlow, Montana, was that a small town notices everything. The second thing she learned was that it doesn't always let on that it's noticed. She had been on the property for 3 days before anyone came to see her. 3 days of working from first light until the darkness made it impossible, pulling debris from the collapsed section of roof, hauling rotted lumber to the edge of the property, sweeping plaster dust from floors that hadn't been swept in 6 years. 3 days of sleeping in the pickup truck because the bedroom floor was too soft to trust, eating crackers and peanut butter and the canned goods she'd found in the underground room, testing each one carefully before committing to it, the way Evelyn's journal had described testing preserved food that had sat too long. The journal was full of things like that. Practical knowledge recorded in that careful handwriting. The kind of knowledge that doesn't come from books, but from decades of living in a place and paying attention to what it teaches you. How to tell if preserved food had gone bad before you opened it. How to bank a wood stove so the fire lasted through a Montana night without burning through all your fuel by midnight. How to read the clouds stacking on the western horizon for what kind of weather they were carrying, and how many hours you had before it arrived. Wren read it every night by the fading light of her phone, rationing the battery the way she rationed everything else, a few pages at a time, until the cold in the truck cab drove her into the sleeping position she had worked out over the first night, jacket over her torso, backpack wedged against the door to block the draft that came through the rusted seal around the window. On the fourth morning, she heard a truck on the road. It pulled up at the edge of the property and stopped, and a woman got out. Wren saw her from the upper window she was clearing of debris, an old woman in a canvas work coat, white hair cut short and practical, moving across the dead grass toward the house with the deliberate pace of someone who has made up her mind about something. Wren came downstairs and met her at the door. The woman stopped and looked at her. Not rudely, just thoroughly, the way people look when they're trying to match something in front of them against something they carry in their memory. "You're the girl who bought this place," the woman said. "Yes, ma'am." She kept looking. "Around the jaw," she said finally, "and the way you stand." Evelyn stood like that, like the ground might try to move and she was ready for it. Wren didn't know what to say to that. "I'm Ida Marsh," the woman said. "I run the feed and supply on Main Street. Evelyn Calloway was my friend for 60 years. She paused. "She talked about your mother. Every Thursday when she came in for supplies, she talked about Jessie. And when Jessie stopped coming home, she talked about waiting." "I know," Wren said. "I read the letters." Something shifted in Ida's face. The set of it changed, became less evaluating and more human. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and walked back to her truck without a word. Wren thought that was the end of it. But Ida opened the tailgate, and in the bed of the truck were things. Rolls of heavy plastic sheeting, slightly torn along one edge. A box of roofing nails, the box water-damaged and soft. A coil of rope. 2 tarps with small punctures patched with tape. "Inventory damage," Ida said, coming back with an armload of the sheeting. "Not worth selling. Still usable if you don't mind working around the imperfections." Wren stared at her. "I wasn't asking for payment," Ida said, her voice carrying the gruffness of someone who is uncomfortable being thanked. "I was asking if you could use it." Something loosened in Wren's chest. A tightness she had been carrying so long she had stopped registering it as tension and had started registering it as just the normal state of being herself. "Yes," she said. "I can use it." That was how it started with Ida. The man came 2 days later. Wren was on the roof, or more precisely, she was attempting to be on the roof, having gotten herself up there by means of a ladder she'd found in the barn and a determination that outpaced her technical ability. She was trying to cover the collapsed section with the plastic sheeting before the weather that had been building in the west for 3 days finally arrived. The sheeting kept sliding. The wind kept working against her. Her hands were bleeding from where the nail heads had caught them, and she was beginning to understand in a very concrete way that there were things she did not know how to do. She heard boots on the ladder. A man appeared at the roofline, 23 or 24, she guessed. Dark hair, a face that didn't give much away, the kind of face that has learned to be still because stillness is a more useful thing than expression in most situations. He looked at the sheeting, at the way she had it half-anchored on one side and flapping uselessly on the other. And without saying anything, he moved to the far corner and held it down with his knee while he drove 2 nails in quick succession with an efficiency that made her own efforts look like what they were. He handed her a nail. She drove it in. They covered the section in 20 minutes. He climbed down first and held the ladder while she descended, a courtesy she hadn't expected and didn't know how to acknowledge without making it awkward. So she just said thank you, and he nodded. His name was Garrett Hollis. He worked part-time for Ida at the feed and supply, but he seemed to be there every day, which meant the distinction between part-time and full-time was one that existed mainly on paper. He had studied construction for 2 years at a community college in Great Falls before coming back to Harlow when his mother got sick. He had been back for 3 years now. His mother had recovered. He had stayed. He didn't explain why he kept coming back to the farm. The first week, Wren assumed he was there because Ida had sent him. The second week, she started to suspect the truth was more complicated. The third week, she asked him directly, "Ida sent you?" He was quiet for a moment. The way he was always quiet before he said something, as though he was checking the words against some internal standard before releasing them. "Ida asked me to check on you," he said. "The first time. And after that?" He picked up a board and tested it for rot, pressing his thumbnail into the grain the way she had seen him do a dozen times, reading the wood the way some people read faces. He set it aside in the pile he was calling salvageable, which was considerably smaller than the pile he was calling kindling. "My grandmother used to say that when someone does something for your family that they didn't have to do, you don't forget it just because the people are gone," he said. "Evelyn Calloway sat with my mother through the worst night of her life and didn't leave until morning. I was about 8 years old. I didn't understand what was happening, but I understood that this woman came when she didn't have to, and she stayed when leaving would have been easier." He picked up another board and went back to work. That was the end of the explanation. It was also, Wren understood, the whole of it. He came every morning, and he worked with a quiet competence that Wren found herself trying to learn from. Watching the way he read a structure before he touched it, the way he thought 3 steps ahead of the nail he was currently driving, the way he seemed to understand what a building was trying to tell him about where it was failing and why. He taught her things, not in the way of formal instruction, in the way of someone who does a thing correctly and doesn't make a point of it, and lets the watching do the teaching. She learned to test wood for rot before she committed weight to it. She learned to read a wall for where the water had come in by looking at the staining patterns rather than the obvious damage, because the obvious damage was never where the problem started. She learned to square a corner properly, and why a corner that was almost square would cause problems 6 months later that you'd never connect to the original mistake. Loretta Wynn at the diner hired her the second week of April. 3 nights a week, washing dishes, mopping floors, doing whatever needed doing after the dinner rush cleared out. Minimum wage, cash, no paperwork. When Wren asked why she was being so straightforward about the arrangement, Loretta leaned against the counter and looked at her. "Evelyn came in here every Sunday after church," she said. "Same booth, same order, coffee and whatever pie I had that day. She talked about Jesse all the time. She'd take out photographs and show me, same photographs every week, like she was afraid I might forget what Jesse looked like if she didn't remind me." She paused. She was so sure Jesse would come back. She looked at Wren in a way that was neither pitying nor sentimental, just honest. "I guess she was right," she said, "just not the way she expected." Wren worked at that diner 3 nights a week for the rest of the spring and into summer, scrubbing pots until her hands cracked and mopping floors until her lower back developed an ache that was becoming permanent, eating whatever Loretta couldn't sell at the end of the night, which was sometimes the only real meal she had that day. It wasn't glamorous. It was survival done the way survival usually gets done. Not dramatically, just one small decision at a time, one morning after another. By late May, she had a roof that didn't leak in most places. She had walls that blocked the wind on all 4 sides. She had cleared the kitchen enough to cook in it, using a camp stove she'd bought at the hardware store for $11. She had running water again, not hot water, but cold water from the pipes that Garrett had tested and declared sound in the sections that mattered. She had also met Warren Galt. He came on a Tuesday morning in early June, when the fields around the farmhouse were finally starting to show something other than dead grass and last winter's debris. He came in a truck that was new enough that the chrome on the front grille caught the sun and threw it back at you. His boots were clean in the way that said they were expensive rather than unused. His smile arrived before he did, wide and warm and not quite reaching his eyes. "Miss Calloway," he said, like her name was something he'd looked up. "I wanted to come by and welcome you to the area. Introduce myself. Neighbors ought to know each other." She waited. He pulled a folded paper from the inside pocket of his coat and held it out. "I also wanted to make you a fair offer," he said. $3,000 for the property, as is. You could be settled and gone by the end of the month. Wren looked at the paper but didn't take it. The property isn't for sale, she said. Galt's smile held. Everything's for sale, he said. It's just a matter of finding the right price. He looked past her at the house, at the patched roof and the porch that was still half collapsed on the left side. You're young, he said. You don't know yet how much it costs to keep a place like this running. The isolation, the winters, the thousand things that go wrong and keep going wrong. He brought his eyes back to her. I'm trying to save you the trouble of finding out the hard way. My great-grandmother kept this land in our family for 60 years, Wren said. I intend to do the same. The smile didn't leave Galt's face, but something behind it changed. A small tightening, a recalculation. Evelyn was a stubborn woman, he said. Sat out here alone for years, watching this place fall apart around her. Refused every offer I made. He folded the paper back into his pocket. I hope that stubbornness works out better for you than it did for her. He walked back to his truck without hurrying. At the door, he stopped. You've got 90 days from the auction to settle the tax debt, he said, without turning around. If you miss that deadline, the county takes it, and I'll be there when it goes back up. Then he got in and drove away, and the chrome on his grill caught the sun again on the way out, and Wren stood in the yard watching the dust settle on the road after him. She went back to work. Summer in Montana surprised her. She had not expected beauty. She had expected more of the same gray and cold and difficult, and instead she got mornings that smelled like grass warming up after a cool night, evenings where the sky turned colors she had no names for, long golden afternoons where the light came across the fields at an angle that made everything look like it was lit from the inside out. She learned things that summer that had no names in the world she'd come from. How to read the soil before you planted in it, what its color and texture and smell told you about what it could and couldn't support, how to split wood along the grain so each piece came apart clean rather than fighting you, how to recognize a shift in light quality that meant a storm was building 3 hours out, how to feel it in the air before it showed in the clouds. She read Evelyn's journal from beginning to end and then started it again from the beginning, reading it slower the second time, absorbing it the way you absorb something that you've realized is more important than you initially understood. Evelyn had recorded everything, not just practical skills, but the reasoning behind them, the why underneath the how, the accumulated logic of a person who had thought seriously about how to live in a specific place for a very long time. August brought in the first real harvest from the kitchen garden she had planted in late May, tomatoes and green beans and a row of carrots that came up crooked but came up. She canned what she could, following the instructions in Evelyn's journal step by step, checking and rechecking each seal. Garrett showed her how to test a jar seal properly, pressing the center of the lid to feel if it flexed, explaining why a failed seal didn't always announce itself. Delia and her children came to stay in September, not because Wren had planned for them to. Delia Voss had been Loretta's cousin's neighbor in Roanoke, which was the kind of connection that only makes sense in small networks of people who know each other across large distances because necessity has taught them to maintain those connections. She was 36, a bookkeeper by training, a widow by misfortune, traveling with her 9-year-old son Owen and her 5-year-old daughter June to a job in Billings that had promised more than it was now delivering, in a car that had been promising more than it could deliver for 2 years. The car had broken down on the road through Harlow. Loretta, still in town then, had pointed her toward Wren. Wren had a spare room. Delia had a car that needed 2 weeks to fix and a budget that didn't have room for 2 weeks of motel. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Owen was serious and quiet with a way of observing things before engaging with them that reminded Wren of Garrett. He learned to stack firewood correctly the first time Wren showed him, and after that he did it without being asked, which was more than could be said for most people twice his age. June was 5 years old and apparently incapable of fear, and she had decided within the first 24 hours that Wren was the most interesting person she had ever met and intended to follow her everywhere until she had gathered enough evidence to confirm or revise this assessment. "Why do you live out here?" June asked on the second day, following Wren across the yard toward the barn. "Because it's mine," Wren said. June considered this with the gravity that 5-year-olds bring to matters they find genuinely puzzling. "Did you buy it?" "I did. With money?" $7. June thought about this for a while. That's not very much money, she said. No, Wren agreed, it wasn't. But June seemed satisfied with this answer in a way that adults rarely were. And she moved on to her next question, which was about the chickens, which Wren had acquired from a neighbor who was downsizing, and whether they had names, and if not, whether they could be given names, and if so, could June be the one to name them? You can name them, Wren said, but you're also feeding them. June accepted this bargain without hesitation. October came hard. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a week and kept dropping. The first frost arrived early, killing the last of the garden before Wren had gotten everything in. She spent 2 days working in near-freezing rain, harvesting what she could salvage, her hands so cold by the end of each day that she couldn't feel her fingers and had to warm them over the stove before she could write in the notebook she had started keeping, following Evelyn's example. And then, in the third week of October, everything went wrong at once. The accident happened on a Thursday. Garrett had come out to help her reinforce a load-bearing beam in the barn, the one that ran along the interior east wall and was showing signs of stress that neither of them liked the look of. The barn was more unstable than they had assessed from the outside. Structures that have been leaning for years develop stress patterns that aren't always visible until you start putting pressure on adjacent elements. And the beam they were working on was connected to the roof section above it in ways that only became clear after they had already committed to the repair. Wren heard the crack before she understood what it meant. The sound of old wood giving up, sudden and total, the way a decision sounds when something has been holding it back for a long time and then stops. The beam shifted. The roof section above it moved. Garrett saw it happening before she did. He shouted something she didn't catch and threw his weight against her, pushing her sideways and backward through the open barn door. And she hit the frozen ground outside and rolled and came up, already turning back to look. The section came down in one piece. It hit where they had been standing and sent a cloud of dust and old hay billowing out through the open door. Garrett was on the ground inside, half covered by the fallen material. He had gotten mostly clear. Mostly. His shoulder was at an angle it wasn't supposed to be at. He was breathing, she could see that from the doorway, but his face was the color of old concrete, and he wasn't moving anything on his right side. She dug him out with her hands and called for help on her cell phone, standing in the doorway of the ruined barn with the dust still settling, and she kept her voice level because that was the only useful thing she could do with it. The clinic in town was small but functional. The doctor who saw Garrett told Wren in the waiting room that his shoulder was dislocated and 2 ribs were cracked. He'd be all right. He needed rest and time, and to stay out of collapsing barns for the foreseeable future. Ida arrived 40 minutes after Wren called her. She came through the clinic door with the contained energy of someone who is holding something large and forceful very carefully in check. She looked at Wren once, and then she looked away, and when she looked back there was something in her face that Wren had not seen there before. She didn't raise her voice. That was almost worse than if she had. I asked him to check on you, Ida said. Not to risk his neck on that barn. That's on me. I should have been clearer. Ida, Wren started. Ida held up her hand. The gesture was not aggressive, it was just final. Garrett is my responsibility, she said, and I made a mistake with how I handled that. She looked at the floor for a moment, then back at Wren. Stay away from him while he heals, and give me some time. She left. Garrett sent a text message from his mother's house 2 days later. He had been transferred there to recover, his mother's place being across the county line, closer to the clinic he'd be seeing for follow-up. The message said, I'm okay, don't worry, back when I can. When he can, Wren thought. When he can wasn't now. Now was all she had. The second blow came 6 days after the accident. Warren Galt had purchased the building that housed Loretta's diner. He had purchased it quietly, through a property management company with a name that didn't connect to him unless you knew what you were looking at. And he had purchased it specifically, Wren understood in retrospect, to use it as leverage. The rent increase notice arrived on a Thursday. Effective immediately, double the current rate. Loretta called her that night. I can't fight it, she said. Her voice was flat with a tiredness that went past the financial question into something deeper. The tiredness of someone who has been fighting small battles for a long time and has finally decided that this one isn't worth what it would cost. I can't afford the new rent and keep the lights on both. I'm sorry, honey. I have to let you go. The diner closed 2 weeks later. Loretta packed up what was hers and drove to Roanoke to stay with her sister. Wren stood in the empty diner on the last day and looked at the booth where Evelyn had sat every Sunday with her coffee and her pie and her photographs of a daughter who had run and wasn't coming back. She stood there until the cold of the empty building worked all the way through her coat, and then she went back to the farm. 1 week. She had lost Garrett and Ida and Loretta in 1 week. She sat down and did the math. 90 days from the auction had become 60 days. She had $40 and no job. The tax debt was still $4,800. Delia had been contributing what she could from the bookkeeping work she'd picked up from 2 businesses in town, but it wasn't enough. It was not close to enough. Galt came back on a Friday. He stood in her doorway in his clean boots, and his smile was the same smile it had always been, warm at the surface and cold 3 millimeters underneath. Last chance, he said. $5,000. More than the property's worth on any honest assessment. You take it, you walk away free and clear. No. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite pity, not quite satisfaction. Something more neutral than either of those things. The expression of someone who has seen this before and knows exactly how it ends. Stubborn, he said. Just like your grandmother. He left. Wren closed the door and stood in the hallway and listened to the sound of his truck on the road until it faded into the distance. Then she walked to the kitchen and sat down at the table where Evelyn's journal lay open to a page about reading weather, and she put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Outside, the wind was picking up from the west. The temperature was dropping. Somewhere on the edge of the sky, something was building. She had 20 days until the tax deadline. She had $40. She had a property she had promised herself she would not leave. And she was starting to understand, concretely and completely, what it meant to make a promise you didn't have the resources to keep. December came the way December comes in Montana. Not gradually, not with any of the slow concessions that winter makes in gentler climates, but all at once, like a decision that has finally been made. The temperature went to 0 and stayed there. The ground froze to a depth that made sound travel differently, harder and sharper. Every footstep on the frozen grass a small percussion. The sky turned white by day and a deep, starless black by night. Wren learned things about cold that she had not known before. That it has layers, that the cold of early December is a different quality from the cold of late December, the way a river is different depending on how far from the source you're standing. That a wood stove that can heat a room adequately in November becomes something you have to manage carefully in January, feeding it deliberately, banking it correctly, thinking about it as a relationship rather than a convenience. That cold finds weakness the way water finds it, through every gap and crack and insufficient insulation and bad seal, and that no matter how much you patch, there is always another path it hasn't taken yet. She was managing. That was the word she used in the notebook she kept, following Evelyn's practice. Managing, not thriving, not comfortable, but managing. Owen helped with the firewood, which he had become genuinely skilled at, developing an eye for how to stack it that accounted for air circulation and weight distribution in ways that Wren had to look twice to fully appreciate. June named all the chickens and held to the names with a seriousness that Wren found unexpectedly moving, calling each one by name when she fed them in the mornings, apparently believing, with the logic of a 5-year-old, that being known was the same as being cared for. Delia sat with Wren at the kitchen table on a cold evening in the middle of December and went through the numbers with her. They went through them slowly and honestly, the way you have to go through numbers when they're not on your side. "We're short," Delia said. She didn't say it as a judgment. She said it the way a navigator says you are here, on a map that shows exactly where you need to be instead, and how much distance lies between those 2 points. "I know. If nothing changes between now and the deadline, we're about $3,000 short of what the county requires." "I know." Delia was quiet for a moment. She was the kind of person who waited to speak until she had something worth saying, which made her silence feel different from other people's silence. It had content to it. She was thinking, and Wren had learned to wait for the thought. "What do you want to do?" Delia asked. Wren looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the 13 birthday cards in her backpack. She thought about Evelyn sitting in Loretta's diner every Sunday with photographs of a daughter who was never coming back. She thought about the underground room where a man named Edmund Calloway had put provisions against the end of the world, and his granddaughter had kept them up for 60 years against a different kind of ending. "I'm not leaving," Wren said. Delia nodded slowly. Then we need to find $3,000 in 20 days. Neither of them said the rest of what was true, which was that they didn't know where it was going to come from, and that not knowing had a weight to it that settled on you in the small hours of the night and made sleep something you had to work toward rather than something that simply came. Christmas Eve arrived with a storm that shut down the county road system by noon and the highway by 4 in the afternoon. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero by 8 at night. The wind drove the snow sideways across the fields, making the air a white, undifferentiated thing with no distance in it, no horizon, no reference point at all. The farmhouse held against it. The stove burned. Owen and June slept in the room they shared at the back of the house, wrapped in quilts. And Delia sat up with Wren for a while before going to bed herself. And then it was just Wren at the kitchen table with the stove and the storm and the numbers she already knew and couldn't change by looking at them again. She was thinking about giving up. Not dramatically, not in the way of a person who has decided something final, just in the practical way of someone who has run the calculations one too many times and is beginning to accept what they keep showing her. She could walk away. She could go back to what she knew. She had survived 2 years of that life. She could survive more of it. She was still sitting there when she saw the lights. They appeared through the gap in the curtains, faint and irregular, moving up the road that led to the property. At first she thought she was imagining them. Nobody drove in weather like this. Nobody who had a choice. But the lights kept coming, and they were moving wrong, weaving in a way that suggested they were moving with difficulty rather than intention. And then they stopped altogether at the low point in the road where the drainage ditch crossed and filled with snow every winter. She put on every layer she owned. The cold outside was a different category of cold from anything she had experienced. It was not a temperature. It was a presence. It pressed on every exposed surface and moved into the gaps between her layers with a speed and thoroughness that felt almost deliberate, as though it had been waiting for her to open the door and had immediately begun working on the problem of how to stop her. She crossed the yard with her head down and the lantern held against her body to protect the flame. The ditch was 30 yards from the house, less in better conditions, but the distance through that storm was a different kind of distance. She walked it counting steps. The car was a small sedan, completely wrong for this road in this weather. Its rear wheels sunk into the snow-filled ditch, the engine running in the laboring way of an engine, working very hard at something it was never designed to do. Through the window she could see shapes, people. She banged on the glass. A woman's face appeared, dark-haired, eyes wide and carrying an amount of fear that Wren recognized as the fear of someone who has understood exactly how bad their situation is. She got the door open. "My daughter," the woman said. Her voice was raw. "Please, my daughter." In the back seat, a boy of 9 or 10 was pressed against the door, and beside him, underneath a coat that had been arranged over her like a blanket, was a small girl. Wren reached in and touched the girl's face. Her skin was cold in a way that human skin is not supposed to be cold. Her lips had gone a color that Wren had read about in Evelyn's journal, in the section on weather emergencies, on what to do when someone had been in the cold too long. The blue-gray that meant the body had begun to redirect blood away from the surface and toward the core, which was the body's emergency response, its last serious attempt to protect what mattered most. Wren had read those pages 3 times. She had not understood when she read them that she was reading them for a reason. She lifted the girl out of the car. She was light, impossibly light, the lightness of a child who was 5 years old and had been in a cold car for too long. "Move," Wren said to the woman. "Follow me and keep moving." The walk back to the house was the longest 30 yards she had ever covered. Inside, she did what Evelyn's journal had told her to do, exactly as Evelyn had described it, in the tone of someone who had learned these things not from reading, but from necessity. You did not warm a hypothermic person quickly. That was the thing most people got wrong, the instinct that could kill. You warm them slowly, gradually, beginning from the core and working outward, because the cold blood in their extremities, rushing back toward the heart too fast, could stop it. She wrapped the girl in blankets and placed her near the stove. Not close enough to feel the heat directly, just close enough for the temperature of the room to begin its work. She told the mother, whose name she didn't know yet, to get under the blankets with her daughter. Skin against skin. Body heat shared the slow, careful way that bodies have been sharing it for as long as there have been bodies and cold and the stubborn insistence on survival. And then Wren sat in the chair beside the stove and kept the fire going and watched and waited. Owen woke up around midnight and came to see what was happening. He looked at the girl and the woman on the floor by the stove, and then he looked at Wren, and she said quietly, "They're going to be all right. Go back to bed." And he looked at her for one more moment with those serious dark eyes, and then he went. Delia got up at 2 in the morning and came and sat beside Wren without asking questions, which was one of the things about Delia that Wren had come to value most. She understood when questions were useful and when they were just noise. At 4 in the morning, the girl cried. It was a weak sound, a sound that cost something to make. But it was a sound, and the woman on the floor heard it and pulled her daughter closer and made a sound of her own that was not quite a word, but carried more meaning than most words Wren had ever heard. "She's going to be okay," Wren said. The woman looked up at her over her daughter's head. Her name, she said later, once she could say anything coherently, was Delia Voss. She had been driving to Billings. The storm had closed the highway. She had taken an alternate route she didn't know. The rest was the storm's story to tell, not hers. "You saved her," Delia Voss said, looking at Wren across the room. Wren looked at the girl, who was breathing now with the slow regularity of a child in real sleep, and at the fire she had kept going through the longest night of the year, and at the journal on the table, Evelyn's handwriting visible from across the room, the careful documentation of a woman who had known things and written them down so that someone else might know them too. "I had help," Wren said quietly, "from someone who figured I might need it someday." Delia Voss and her children did not leave after the storm. Not right away, and then not at all. It started practical. Her car needed serious work, more than Harlow's one mechanic could turn around quickly. She had spent most of her emergency fund on the road before the storm. The job in Billings had already moved on. She had nowhere pressing to be, and 2 children who had survived something frightening and needed, both of them, to be somewhere that felt solid for a while. She sat down with Wren's finances on the 3rd day and looked at them the way a bookkeeper looks at things, without the emotional weight that the person living inside the numbers brings to them. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, with the directness that Wren was already coming to recognize as her essential quality, "You need $3,000 in 17 days. I can't produce $3,000, but I can help you manage what you have down to the last cent. And I can take the bookkeeping for 2 businesses in town that aren't being done well. And together those things might get you close enough that something else can close the gap." "What about you?" Wren asked. Delia looked at her children. Owen was helping June retrieve a chicken that had escaped the coop, his face set with the seriousness he brought to every task. June was talking to the chicken as though explaining the situation to it might encourage cooperation. "I'm good at making things work with less than they need," Delia said. "I've had practice." The something else that closed the gap came on the 10th day of January. It came in the form of Ida Marsh, standing at the front door with a covered dish in both hands, and a look on her face that suggested she had argued with herself about coming, and the argument had been close. "I heard about Christmas Eve," Ida said. "Word travels fast in a small town." Wren stepped back to let her in. Ida set the dish on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a moment before she looked at Wren. "Evelyn would have done the same thing," she said. "She would have gone out in that storm without thinking twice. She would have done exactly what you did." Wren waited. Ida reached into her coat pocket and produced an envelope. "Evelyn left this with me years ago," she said. "She told me to hold it until someone from her family came home. She said if no one ever came, I could use it for the property taxes when they got too far behind." She paused. "I should have given it to you sooner. I wasn't sure you'd stay." Inside the envelope was a check for $300, written on an account that had Evelyn Calloway's name printed at the top. "And there's one more thing," Ida said. She looked at Wren carefully. "Garrett is healing well. He's been asking about the farm. He'd like to come back and help finish the barn work when he's cleared by the doctor, if you'll have him." Wren looked at the check in her hands, at the name printed at the top, at the handwriting that was Evelyn's handwriting, on a document Evelyn had prepared years ago for someone she had hoped would come. "Tell him yes," Wren said. On a gray afternoon in mid-January, with the cold still settled hard over the valley, but the worst of it beginning to feel like something survivable rather than something inevitable, Wren walked into the county clerk's office and put $6,200 on the counter in front of Doris. She had counted it 4 times before she left the house. Doris looked at the money and then at Wren, and she processed the payment with the efficiency of a woman who has been doing paperwork for 30 years and intends to do it for 30 more. She stamped the receipt. Paid in full, she said. She slid the receipt across the counter. Then she paused, which Wren had not seen her do before. She was a woman of efficient gestures, and a pause meant something. Your great-grandmother paid that bill every year for 60 years, Doris said. Sometimes it wasn't easy, but she never missed it. Not once. Wren took the receipt and folded it and put it in her jacket pocket, next to where she kept a Polaroid photograph of her mother. She walked out into the January afternoon. The sky was white and the air was cold, and the road back to the farm stretched out ahead of her through fields that were still frozen, but would not be frozen forever. And somewhere at the end of that road, a farmhouse stood with its new roof and its patched walls and its lights on in the windows. She had paid what was owed. She had earned the right to be here. But Warren Galt wasn't finished, and the paper he was about to file with the county would threaten to take from her not the land itself, but something without which the land was meaningless. And what the old lawyer Garrett brought to her door the following April would find, buried in 30 years of county records, was a truth that went back further than the tax debt and deeper than the access road. A truth about why her mother had run and whether she had ever had a choice. Garrett Hollis came back on a Tuesday in the first week of April. Wren heard his truck on the road before she saw it. That sound of the engine she had come to recognize over the months he had spent working alongside her. A sound that had been absent long enough to feel like a missing word in a sentence she kept trying to finish. She was on the east side of the house, pulling dead wood from the base of the apple trees, checking which ones had survived the winter and which had not. 4 of the 12 were gone, the wood too far gone to recover, but the other 8 were showing the first tentative signs of life. Small, tight buds along the lower branches, the tree's equivalent of a cautious announcement. She straightened up when she heard the truck. Garrett got out moving carefully, with the economy of someone who has spent weeks being reminded that certain movements cost more than they used to. His right shoulder sat slightly lower than his left. He looked at her across the yard and raised his left hand in greeting. She raised hers back. He came to where she was standing and looked at the apple trees, at the dead ones and the living ones, reading them the way he read everything, before he said anything about himself. 4 gone, she said. He nodded. 8 left is enough to work with. That was all either of them said about the winter, about the barn and the months of absence and the silence on both sides of it. Some things don't need to be reconstructed out loud. Sometimes the acknowledgement of them is already contained in the act of showing up again. He wasn't alone. The man who climbed out of the passenger side of Garrett's truck was 74 years old, with white hair and the kind of face that comes from decades of courtroom work, watchful and patient, giving nothing away by accident. He was wearing a blazer that had probably been good quality 20 years ago and had been worn enough since then to achieve a comfortable authority that expensive new clothes never quite manage. He carried a battered leather briefcase and moved with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had long since stopped feeling that speed was impressive. His name was Rupert Ashby. He had practiced law in Great Falls for 40 years before retiring to a cabin on the river outside Harlow to fish and read, and by his own account, avoid most of humanity with great success. He had been retired for 9 years. He had not touched a case file in 8. He stood in Wren's kitchen and looked at the papers she had been served 3 weeks earlier. The notice from a property management company informing her that Warren Galt, as legal owner of the access strip crossing the northwest corner of the county road approach to her property, was asserting his right to restrict access to that strip effective 60 days from the date of the notice. He read through the papers twice. He did not say anything while he was reading. When he finished, he set them on the table and looked up at Wren. "How long has that road been used to access your property?" he asked. "As long as the property has existed, as far as I can tell," Wren said. "There are references to it in the original homestead records. Anyone ever disputed access before?" "Not that I found any record of." Rupert picked up the papers again and looked at a specific section. "He bought this strip in 1998, he said. 26 years ago. He never built on it, never developed it, never restricted access to it, just owned it." He set the papers down again. "That's not how you buy land you intend to use. That's how you buy land you intend to use as a weapon later. Wren had thought the same thing. She had not been able to make it sound like anything other than suspicion, which was a different thing from evidence. "I'll take the case," Rupert said. "I can't pay you right now," Wren said. "I can pay you eventually if things go the way I'm working toward, but right now I have—" He held up his hand. "I'm not interested in payment." He looked at Garrett, and something passed between them that suggested this had already been discussed in the truck on the way over. "I practiced law in this county for 40 years, he said. "I know what Warren Galt is. I know what he does and how he does it and how long he has been doing it. I have been waiting for 30 years for someone to give me a reason to go back into a courtroom." He picked up his briefcase. "You've given me one. That's enough." He left with the papers and a copy of every property document Wren had, and he went back to his cabin by the river, and for 3 weeks she heard almost nothing from him. A phone call asking for a specific document, a text message asking her to confirm a date from the homestead records. Silence that felt, she told Delia, like the silence of someone working rather than the silence of someone who has given up. It was in the 4th week that he called her. "Come to the cabin," he said. "There's something you need to hear." She drove out on a Wednesday afternoon, down the river road that wound between cottonwood trees that were just beginning to leaf out in the pale, uncertain green of early spring. Rupert's cabin sat back from the bank, modest and well-maintained, with a woodpile that was stacked with the precision of someone who takes structural integrity seriously in all contexts. He was on the porch when she arrived, 2 mugs of coffee on the table beside him, as though he had timed her arrival exactly. He waited until she was seated and had the coffee in her hands before he opened the folder on the table between them. "I've been pulling records," he said. "County property records, court filings, tax documents, everything that touches on Warren Galt's land acquisitions over the past 35 years. He looked at her over the rim of his own mug. "There's a pattern. It's not subtle once you know what you're looking at. It's just been spread across enough time and enough individual transactions that nobody ever looked at all of it together." "What kind of pattern?" Wren asked. "He buys from people who can't protect themselves," Rupert said. "Elderly landowners with no family nearby. Estates in probate with no clear heir. Property owners in financial distress who need to move fast. He finds them at the moment of maximum vulnerability, and he makes offers that are technically legal, but are structured in ways the seller doesn't fully understand. Sometimes he waits. He bought that access strip and sat on it for 26 years, waiting for a moment when it would be useful." He turned a page into the folder. "The strip he's claiming was sold to him in October of 1998 by a man named Thomas Calloway," he said. "Evelyn's brother-in-law, her husband's brother. Thomas had been on the property since the early 70s, living in the small outbuilding on the south end of the land. He was in his 80s by 1998. He sold the strip for $200. Wren looked at the document. $200 for a piece of land that, 26 years later, was the legal lever being used to cut her off from her own property. "There's a problem with the sale," Rupert said. He slid another document across the table. "Thomas Calloway was diagnosed with vascular dementia in the spring of 1996. By 1998, his cognitive decline was documented and significant. There are medical records. There's a note in his file from his doctor recommending that he not be permitted to make major financial decisions without supervision." He paused. "The sale happened anyway. Thomas signed. His signature is on the document. But at the time he signed it, he did not have the legal capacity to enter into a binding contract." Wren absorbed this. "Which means the sale was fraudulent," she said. "Potentially voidable," Rupert said. "Which in practical terms means the same thing. The land should never have transferred to Galt, which means Galt's claim to the access strip has no legal foundation." He closed the folder. "But there's more," he said. He opened a second folder. This one thinner, the documents inside older, the paper carrying the brittleness of things that have been filed and forgotten and not touched since. In October of 1998, the same month as the sale, a complaint was filed with the county sheriff's department. He turned the document so she could read it. The complainant was a 17-year-old girl. She stated that she had evidence that Warren Galt had obtained a property transfer through fraudulent means, specifically by inducing a person with documented cognitive impairment to sign a contract he did not understand. Wren's hands were very still on the table. "The complaint was dismissed," Rupert said, 48 hours after it was filed. No investigation, no follow-up. The disposition listed is insufficient evidence, but there's no record of any evidence being gathered, interviewed, or reviewed. He looked at her. The county sheriff in 1998 was a man named Dale Pruitt. He held the position for 16 years. He was Warren Galt's first cousin. Wren looked at the name on the complaint. The name of the complainant was Jessica Calloway. She was 17 years old when she filed it, Rupert said quietly. And there is one more thing. He slid the last document across. It was a record from the county's public transit log, a document that recorded passengers on the regional bus routes for insurance and scheduling purposes. 1 week after the complaint was dismissed, he said, a female passenger traveling alone with no listed destination boarded a westbound Greyhound at the Harlow Depot. The passenger's name was recorded as J. Calloway. She was listed as 17 years of age. There was no return ticket. The room was very quiet. Wren looked at the transit record, at the date, at the single initial in the surname she carried, at the notation in the destination column that said unspecified, which was bureaucratic language for I don't know where I'm going, which was the truest thing you could say about a 17-year-old girl boarding a bus alone at night with no luggage and a complaint that had just been buried by her enemy's cousin. She didn't leave, Wren said. Her voice came out low. Not the way it comes out when you're trying to be quiet. The way it comes out when something has shifted in the machinery of how you understand things and the adjustment hasn't finished yet. She was pushed out, Rupert said. She had evidence that could have destroyed Warren Galt. She filed a complaint and it was dismissed in 48 hours by someone who owed Galt more than he owed the law. And then something happened, something we don't have the record of but can infer from the consequence. And your mother left Harlow on a bus in the middle of the night and never came back. Wren thought about the letters in Evelyn's underground room. 47 of them, each one returned unopened, address after address, year after year of looking. She thought about the birthday cards, the careful handwriting year after year, the small domestic details of a life recorded for someone who might never read them. She didn't know, Wren said. Evelyn didn't know why she left. There's no way she could have, Rupert said. Whatever happened between your mother and Galt, it happened privately. Your mother apparently didn't tell Evelyn the reason she was leaving. Maybe she was protecting her. Maybe she thought the less Evelyn knew, the safer she would be. Wren thought about her mother at 17, standing in this county with a piece of evidence that could have brought a powerful man down, watching that evidence get buried in 2 days by a corrupted process, understanding that the same power that had buried the complaint could reach further than the sheriff's department if it needed to. She ran to protect her family, Wren said. Rupert looked at her. That's how I read it, he said. She spent the rest of her life thinking she had abandoned them. She never knew it was safe to come back. Rupert let the silence settle before he spoke again. When he did, his voice had the quality of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is finally setting it down in the right place. I want to use all of this, he said. The fraudulent sale, the dismissed complaint, the record of your mother's departure, all of it. I want to put it in front of a judge and let the whole thing see daylight for the first time in 26 years. He looked at her steadily. There are risks. Galt has resources. He'll fight it. It may take time we don't have before his access restriction becomes enforceable. What do you need from me? Wren asked. He picked up his coffee mug. Your permission, he said, and your patience. The courtroom in the Harlow County Courthouse was small, the way everything in a small county is small, functional and unadorned and slightly worn at the edges from decades of ordinary use. The windows looked out on the main street, and Wren could see the feed and supply from where she sat, the sign that Ida had repainted 2 years ago when the old one finally became illegible, and beyond it the empty space where Loretta's diner had been, before Loretta packed up and drove to Roanoke, and the building sat waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. Warren Galt sat across the aisle with 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than Wren's truck. He had the look of a man who has been in rooms like this before and has always left them in better condition than when he arrived. His face was composed, neutral, the face of someone who has learned that courtrooms reward patience, and that patience is something you can buy. The judge was a woman named Elaine Croft. She had been on the bench for 14 years, gray-haired and precise, with the manner of someone who has heard a great many arguments and has developed an efficient method for separating the ones that hold weight from the ones that merely make noise. She looked over the assembled parties once, briefly, and then she looked at her documents, and the hearing began. Rupert presented his case with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has done this long enough to know that rushing is a form of doubt. He began with the homestead records from 1923, the original claim that established the property and its legal boundaries. He presented the easement documentation, a county filing from 1931 that formally registered the access road as a right-of-way attached to the Callaway property, a filing that predated Warren Galt's ownership of the access strip by 67 years. Galt's lawyers objected, argued, introduced counter documents. Rupert addressed each objection in the same calm and steady tone, without acceleration, without visible irritation, the way a river addresses an obstacle by going around it rather than through it. Then he introduced the medical records. Thomas Callaway's documented diagnosis, the physician's recommendation, the timeline that placed the cognitive decline clearly before the date of the sale. The legal standard for contractual capacity in the state of Montana, which Rupert recited from memory with the accuracy of someone who had looked it up recently and the fluency of someone who had known it for 40 years. Galt's legal team shifted in their seats. "Your Honor," Rupert said, "I have one further item to introduce." He opened the second folder. He presented the 1998 complaint filing in the methodical way he had presented everything, giving the judge time to read it, not rushing her, letting the document make its own argument before he added his. This complaint, he said, was filed by a 17-year-old girl who had evidence of the fraudulent transfer we have been discussing. It was dismissed 48 hours later without investigation by the county sheriff at the time, who was the first cousin of the defendant. He let that sit for a moment. 1 week after the complaint was dismissed, the young woman who filed it boarded a bus out of Harlow and never returned. He placed the transit record on the table. Her name was Jessica Callaway, he said. She was the granddaughter of Evelyn Callaway, the original property owner. She was the mother of the plaintiff. She spent the rest of her life in other states and died in a car accident when her daughter was 4 years old. He looked up from the documents. "We cannot know exactly what was said to her," he said. "We don't have a record of a threat because threats of that kind are not generally committed to paper by the people making them. What we have is the sequence: a complaint filed, a complaint buried in 2 days by a compromised process, a 17-year-old girl on a bus in the middle of the night with no luggage and no destination, a family separated for the next 26 years. He paused. "And a piece of land held in quiet ownership for 26 years, doing nothing, producing nothing, until the moment a young woman bought the property at auction and the land suddenly became useful as a tool to drive her off." The courtroom was quiet. Wren was looking at her hands in her lap. She was not going to cry in this courtroom. She had decided that before she came. She was going to sit here and hold herself together and let Rupert do what Rupert had spent 40 years learning to do. She looked up once at Warren Galt. He was looking at the documents on the table in front of Rupert with the expression of someone who has watched a game they thought they understood shift suddenly into something they don't recognize. The composure was still there, the practiced neutrality of a man who has learned to manage his expressions in adversarial situations, but underneath it something else was showing, something colder and less controlled. He was afraid, not of losing the access strip. She understood that. Men like Galt absorbed losses like that and restructured. What he was afraid of was the thing that was opening up behind it, the 30 years of pattern that Rupert had laid out with the patience of someone arranging exhibits that have always existed and have simply been waiting for the right room. "Your Honor," Rupert said, "we respectfully request 2 things. First, that the defendant's claim to the access strip be dismissed, on the grounds that the original 1998 transfer was executed without legal capacity and is therefore void. Second, that all materials relating to the 1998 complaint filing and its dismissal be referred to the State Attorney General's office for review." He closed the folder. Judge Croft looked at the documents for a long moment. She did not look at Galt's lawyers when they began their response, though she listened to them with the appearance of complete attention, the professional attentiveness of someone who has learned to hear everything and weight it correctly. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she looked at Galt. The look lasted no more than 3 seconds. It was not theatrical. It did not need to be. It was the look of someone who has seen enough to form a clear view and is not interested in pretending otherwise. Motion granted on both counts, she said. The gavel came down. Wren sat very still for a moment after the sound. Beside her, Rupert closed his briefcase with the quiet efficiency of someone tidying up after a job completed. Garrett, who had come and was sitting in the row behind her, put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She did not move. Not yet. She looked at the front of the room, at the judge already moving on to the next matter, at the lawyers gathering papers, at the ordinary mechanical resumption of the business of a courtroom that had no idea what it had just done for her, what it had just given back. Then she looked at Warren Galt. He was standing with his lawyers in a tight cluster, their voices low. His face was controlled again, the neutrality reassembled, but he looked older than he had when he walked in. Something had shifted in his posture in a way that was not quite visible, but was completely real. The way a structure looks exactly the same after the moment the failure begins, but before it becomes visible. He did not look at her. She had not expected him to. Garrett drove her back to the farm. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the main street of Harlow move past the windshield in the ordinary way of a Tuesday afternoon. People on their errands, a truck at the hardware store, the empty space where Loretta's diner used to be. Neither of them spoke for a while. The road out of town opened up into the fields and the sky spread wide above them, and still neither of them said anything, because some moments don't need words added to them. She thought about her mother at 17 boarding a bus in the dark with a complaint that nobody would hear, carrying evidence of something unjust and having nowhere to take it that would hold. She thought about Evelyn writing the first birthday card on a winter afternoon, not knowing if the child she was writing to would ever exist to read it. She thought about the underground room and the iron ring in the floor and the sound the hatch made when it finally opened. She had come a long way to sit in that car on that road in that quiet. After a while, Garrett started the engine again at a stop sign he'd idled at too long. She looked over at him. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing Rupert." He glanced at her. "Rupert brought himself," he said. "I just gave him a ride." She looked back at the road. "That was enough," she said. He nodded once and they drove the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of people who have been through enough together that silence has lost its awkward edge. The investigation that followed did not move quickly. Nothing involving state attorneys and decades-old records and patterns spread across 30 years of property transactions moves quickly. But it moved. Rupert had given the Attorney General's office a place to start, and once you have a place to start in that kind of pattern, the pattern tends to reveal itself. By June, 3 former business partners had been contacted by investigators. By August, 2 banks had been asked to produce lending records going back 15 years. By October, a grand jury had been convened, which was not yet an indictment, but was a door opening in a direction Warren Galt had spent 30 years making sure doors didn't open. Wren did not follow the proceedings closely. She knew they were happening. She received occasional updates from Rupert, who had not lost interest simply because his part in the immediate case was concluded. But she had a farm to run, and the farm had been waiting for her attention for a long time, and attention was what she had to offer. The summer that followed was the best she had known. Not because it was easy, because it was not easy. It was work from first light to dark, and then planning and reading by lamplight, but because it was hers in a way that nothing in her life had ever been hers before. She planted the fields that Garrett showed her could support grain. She repaired the apple orchard, cleared the dead wood, fed the living trees, and watched them respond to being cared for with the slow enthusiasm of things that had been waiting a long time for someone to notice them. She expanded the kitchen garden to 3 times its original size, and what it produced went into jars on the pantry shelves in the way she had learned from Evelyn's journal, careful and methodical against winter. Delia stayed. It was not something they formally decided. It was something that simply became true through the accumulation of days and shared work and the logic of people who have proven useful to each other in a crisis and found they prefer each other's company to the alternatives. Delia took over the financial records and the relationships with the county and the suppliers and billings, which freed Wren for the physical work of the farm in a division of labor that suited both of them without either of them having to articulate it. Owen turned 10 that summer and became, without ceremony, a person who knew how to work. Not in the sense of having been told to work or performing work under supervision, but in the deeper sense of someone who understands why work matters and finds satisfaction in doing it correctly. He could read a fence line for weakness. He could stack wood that would stay stacked through a Montana winter. He had developed strong opinions about soil preparation from his own observation and occasional consultation with Garrett, and his opinions were generally correct. June named everything. She named the chickens and the cat that appeared one morning from somewhere and decided to stay, and the 4 apple trees she had claimed as her personal responsibility, and the row of sunflowers she had planted along the south wall of the house because she had found seed packets in Evelyn's underground room and understood, with the instinct of a 6-year-old, that sunflowers were supposed to go along south-facing walls. She was right about that too. Garrett came every day through the summer and into fall, and the work they did together had the quality of something that had found its proper rhythm. 2 people who had figured out how to move around each other without collision, who could spend 8 hours working on the same project without the quiet between them becoming uncomfortable, because it had long since stopped being empty quiet and had become instead the kind of stillness that people carry when they are at ease with where they are. He was teaching her to read the grain of wood before she cut it, a thing she had been trying to learn since the first month, and was finally beginning to understand not as a rule, but as a sensibility. "You're not looking at the surface," he said one afternoon, standing beside her at the workbench in the barn, which they had rebuilt over the course of the summer into something structurally sound. "You're looking at where the tree was trying to go before it became lumber." She looked at the board in her hands differently. He was right. You could see it once he told you what you were looking at. The direction the grain was moving, the history of the tree's growth recorded in the wood itself, the record of wet years and dry years, and which direction the prevailing wind had come from, and how the tree had responded to all of it over the decades of its life. "Every piece of wood is a record," Garrett said. "You just have to know how to read it." She thought about that long after the conversation ended. About records. About the things that get written into the material of a life and stay there long after the person who lived it is gone. The grain of the wood, the letters in the strong box, the handwriting on 13 birthday cards, the transit log entry for a 17-year-old girl with no listed destination. All of it a record, all of it waiting to be read by someone who knew how. In November, Warren Galt left Harlow. The formal announcement, such as it was, came through the county records when the properties began transferring. A ranch that had been in his name for 22 years, a commercial building in town, several smaller parcels. The transfers happened over the course of 6 weeks, processed through a property management company, with the quiet, systematic efficiency of someone liquidating assets under pressure. The investigation had not yet produced an indictment. It would, Rupert told her, but these things moved on legal time rather than human time, and the difference between those two timescales was something the legal system had never felt the need to apologize for. What had happened already was enough to cost Galt his credibility in the county, his relationships with the business partners who had spent years benefiting from association with him, and had immediately concluded that continued association was no longer in their interest. His access to the credit that had funded the expansion of his operation, and the carefully cultivated reputation of a man who played hard, but played within the rules. The reputation had been the most useful thing he owned. Without it, the rest was just property, and property could be taken. He drove out of Harlow on a Tuesday in late November, on the county road that passed the access strip he had held for 26 years and never used for anything until the moment it had seemed to offer a way to push one more person off one more piece of land. Wren was in the east field when she heard the truck. She watched it pass on the road below. She did not wave. She turned back to what she was doing, which was checking the fence line along the east boundary, preparing it for winter. And she worked until the light faded and the temperature dropped to the point where working with your hands became impractical. And then she walked back to the farmhouse with the cold air coming off the mountains to the west and the lights of the house visible from a long way off. The lights. That was something she had done without thinking about it, starting in the very first weeks, leaving a lamp on in the front window through the night. She had started it practically because she sometimes came in after dark from work, and the lit window was easier to navigate toward than a dark house on a dark road. But it had become something else without her deciding to make it something else. People in town had started using it as a landmark. "Turn at the lighthouse," they told visitors, meaning the farm, meaning the lit window. You could see it from the highway on clear nights, a fixed point in the dark where the valley curved east. She had not known this for a while. Then Ida mentioned it one Thursday, the way she mentioned things, directly and without preamble. People call your place the lighthouse, Ida said. You know that? Wren hadn't known. Evelyn used to leave a light on too, Ida said. Different window. But she always kept one on. She paused, and for a moment her face had the expression of someone standing at the intersection of something that used to be and something that is now, recognizing that the distance between those 2 points is smaller than they'd expected. Some things pass down without anyone deciding to pass them, Ida said. Then she picked up her coffee and didn't say anything else about it. The farm had begun to draw people in the way that lit places draw people in the dark. Not many and not dramatically, but consistently. A woman whose husband had died and who had lost the house in the settlement and needed somewhere to land for a month while she found her footing. A boy of 17 who had aged out of a group home in Billings and had no more idea of what came next than Wren had at 18, standing in a bus station with $175. A man who had served 2 tours and couldn't sleep under a roof anymore, but could sleep in the barn, which Wren had rebuilt and insulated, and which was warmer than he expected and quieter than anywhere he had tried in 3 years of trying. She didn't make a program of it. She didn't hang a sign. She just didn't turn anyone away. And the word spread the way word spreads in places where people are paying attention, quietly and accurately. Delia managed the logistics with the competent directness she brought to everything else, figuring out what people needed and what the farm could provide, and where those 2 things could be made to meet without breaking either one. It works, Delia told her one evening, going over the numbers at the kitchen table, because we don't try to carry people. We just give them a place to stand while they figure out how to carry themselves. That was the right way to say it. Wren thought about it afterward and decided it was not just the right way to say it, but the right way to think about it. The thing that made the difference between a place that helped people and a place that made people dependent on being helped. Evelyn had known that. Wren could see it in the journal, in the way Evelyn wrote about the people she had helped over the decades, the travelers and the struggling families, and the young women who came to her when they had nowhere else to go. She never wrote about saving anyone. She wrote about making room. The spring of the 3rd year was when she found the last letter. She had been going through the contents of the underground room again, cataloging what was there, setting aside what could still be used and what needed to go. The canned goods that were too old, the tools that were beyond salvage. She was working carefully because the room felt like something that deserved to be treated carefully, a place where someone had put thought and care and provision into the structure of the future. At the back of the room, behind the lowest shelf, pushed into the gap between the shelf and the wall, in the way you push something when you want it to be found eventually, but not immediately, was a small flat envelope. Not in the strong box with the rest. Separate. As though it had been placed there deliberately at a different time, after some other decision had been made. On the front, in Evelyn's handwriting, slightly shakier than the earliest letters, but steadier than the last birthday card. For whoever finds this place. Wren sat down on the bottom step with the envelope in her hands. She opened it slowly. The letter inside was 2 pages, written on the same kind of paper Evelyn used for everything, the paper of a person who bought things once and used them completely. My dear one, it began. I don't know who you are. I don't know if you're Jesse, finally coming home after all these years. I don't know if you're someone I never had the chance to meet, someone who found this place by a road I can't see from here. It doesn't matter. You're here. You found it. That makes you family, whatever else you are or aren't. Wren read slowly. This land has been in my family for 100 years. It's seen hard times and better times. It's buried people I loved and raised children I loved and held us when there was nothing else to hold on to. I've seen it in every season, in every kind of weather, in every kind of difficulty a piece of land can put in front of you. And I want you to know that it will hold you too. Whatever brought you here, whatever you're carrying, it will hold you. She turned to the second page. All I ask is this. Keep the light on, not for yourself, for whoever comes next, for whoever is out there in the dark, on a road they don't know, looking for a place that has a light in the window. We are never as alone as we feel in the worst moments. The people who loved us leave pieces of themselves behind, in the wood of the walls, in the soil of the fields, and the light in the window that says someone is here. Someone stayed. Someone decided this place was worth fighting for. They're still here, and now so are you. The letter was signed, with all my love for whoever needs it, Evelyn Calloway. Wren sat in the underground room that Edmund Calloway had built during a war he was afraid might end everything. And she read the letter twice, and then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in her jacket pocket. She climbed the stairs and pulled the hatch closed behind her. Outside, the barn was solid around her, the rebuilt structure that she and Garrett had raised over the course of a long summer, the lumber chosen carefully, each beam placed according to the logic of how load travels through a structure, the roof pitched correctly for the angle of winter storms from the northwest. She put her hand on the nearest post and felt the solidity of it under her palm. She walked out through the barn doors into the spring afternoon. The fields were green, not the tentative green of early spring, but the full committed green of a season that has decided to be itself without apology. The apple trees along the south fence were in bloom, white flowers against the pale sky, and the smell of them carried on the wind that came down from the mountains to the west. Owen was somewhere in the east field. She could see him in the distance, checking the fence line they had repaired in fall. June was in the kitchen garden, doing something with deliberate concentration that probably involved the sunflowers she had established as her domain, intended with the seriousness of a person performing essential work. Delia came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and crossed the yard toward her. She handed Wren a cup. They stood together without talking for a moment, looking at the fields and the mountains beyond them and the permanence of a place that has decided you belong to it. I found something in the room, Wren said. Delia looked at her. A letter from Evelyn. She wrote it for whoever found the place. She paused. She wrote it for me, even though she didn't know it was going to be me. Delia was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking about something fully before she responded. What did she say? She asked. Wren thought about how to answer that. Keep the light on, she said finally. That was the main thing. Keep the light on for whoever comes after you. Delia looked at the farmhouse, at the window where the lamp burned every night, visible from the highway on clear evenings, a fixed point in the dark. She already knew you'd do that, Delia said. She hadn't met me. Delia smiled. She left the letter, didn't she? She picked up her coffee and walked back toward the house, and Wren stood in the yard with the spring wind moving through the apple blossoms, and the mountains standing permanent in the west, and the smell of the fields coming up warm from the ground. She thought about her mother, 17 years old and alone on a bus in the middle of the night, carrying evidence of something unjust and having nowhere to take it that would hold. She thought about her arriving somewhere, eventually, putting down the kind of roots that people put down when they know they cannot go back to where they came from. She thought about her keeping the letter, all those years wherever she went, keeping the letter from Evelyn in a cardboard box with a ring and a photograph, as though she knew she might need it someday, as though some part of her was always planning to come home. She thought about Evelyn at the kitchen table every Thursday, writing letters to an address that wouldn't receive them, and birthday cards to a child she had never met, keeping a room ready with a quilt on the bed, leaving the light on in the window for someone who might never come. And she thought about herself, 18 years old, standing in a ruined barn with $1,100 and a set of rusted keys and a name she was only beginning to understand the weight of. Making a decision not because she was certain it was right, but because the alternative was to keep going nowhere forever, and she had finally run out of tolerance for nowhere. Garrett appeared in the doorway of the barn. He looked across the yard at her and she looked back at him, and he held up the carved wooden sign he had been finishing for the past 2 weeks, the one he had not let her see until it was done. He carried it across the yard and turned it so she could read it. Calloway Farm, it said, established 1923. The letters were burned into the wood with the careful precision of someone who had thought about each one before committing to it. Below the text, he had carved a small image, a farmhouse with a window lit from inside. She looked at it for a long time. It's for the gate, he said, when you're ready. She took it from him and held it and looked at the house and the fields and the lit window and the apple trees in bloom along the fence. And she thought about Edmund Calloway driving stakes into Montana ground in 1923, believing that what he was building would outlast him and matter to people he would never meet. He had been right about that. I'm ready, she said. Garrett nodded. He walked to the gate at the end of the drive and she walked with him, and together they hung the sign on the post, and it moved slightly in the wind from the mountains, and the letters were clear and legible in the afternoon light. Calloway Farm, established 1923. She stood at the gate for a while after Garrett went back to the barn, her hand on the post, looking out at the road that led to town and beyond town, to the highway and beyond the highway, to everywhere she had ever slept on a bus, or behind a laundromat, or in a station waiting for something she couldn't name. She wasn't waiting anymore. She knew what she had. She knew what it had cost. She knew what she owed to the woman who had written birthday cards in the dark and kept a quilt on the bed and left a light on for someone she had never met and might never meet. And she knew the only way to repay that kind of debt was to do the same thing forward, for whoever came next. She turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, toward the lit window, toward the sound of June talking to her sunflowers, and Owen coming in from the east field, and Delia's voice inside saying something Wren couldn't make out, but recognized as home. The lamp in the window burned as the afternoon moved toward evening, visible from the road, visible from the highway on clear nights, a fixed point for anyone out there who was looking for one. She had promised to keep it on. She intended to keep that promise for a very long time.